Don't forget to subscribe. Afterwards, the wisest and most spiritual books from the greatest authors await you every day. And now buckle up, sit back and we'll begin. Carlos Castaneda. Book 10. The Active Side of Infinity. Introduction. This book is a collection of the memorable events in my life. Don Juan revealed to me as time went by that the shamans of ancient Mexico had conceived of this collection of memorable events as a bona fide device to stir caches of energy that exist within the self. They explained these caches as being composed of energy that originates in the body itself and becomes displaced, pushed out of reach by the circumstances of our daily lives. In this sense, the collection of memorable events was, for Don Juan and the shamans of his lineage, the means for redeploying their unused energy, gathered them following the recommendation of Don Juan Matus, a Yaqui Indian shaman from Mexico, who, as a teacher, endeavored for 13 years to make available to me the cognitive world of the shamans who lived in Mexico in ancient times. Don Juan Matus's suggestion that I gather this collection of memorable events was made as if it were something casual, something that occurred to him on the spur of the moment. That was Don Juan's style of teaching. He veiled the importance of certain maneuvers behind the mundane. He hid, in this fashion, the sting of finality, presenting it as something no different from any of the concerns of everyday life. Don Juan revealed to me as time went by that the shamans of ancient Mexico had conceived of this collection of memorable events as a bona fide device to stir caches of energy that exist within the self. They explained these caches as being composed of energy that originates in the body itself and becomes displaced, pushed out of reach by the circumstances of our daily lives. In this sense, the collection of memorable events was, for Don Juan and the shamans of his lineage, the means for redeploying their unused energy. The prerequisite for this collection was the genuine and all-consuming act of putting together the sum total of one's emotions and realizations, without sparing anything. According to Don Juan, the shamans of his lineage were convinced that the collection of memorable events was the vehicle for the emotional and energetic adjustment necessary for venturing, in terms of perception, into the unknown. Don Juan described the total goal of the shamanistic knowledge that he handled as the preparation for facing the definitive journey. The journey that every human being has to take at the end of his life. He said that through their discipline and resolve, shamans were capable of retaining their individual awareness and purpose after death. For them, the vague idealistic state that modern man calls life after death was a concrete region filled to capacity with practical affairs of a different order than the practical affairs of daily life, yet bearing a similar functional practicality. Don Juan considered that to collect the memorable events in their lives was, for shamans, the preparation for their entrance into that concrete region, which they called the active side of infinity. Don Juan and I were talking one afternoon under his ramada, a loose structure made of thin poles of bamboo. It looked like a roofed porch that was partially shaded from the sun, but that would not provide protection at all from the rain. There were some small, sturdy freight boxes there that served as benches. Their freight brands were faded and appeared to be more ornament than identification. I was sitting on one of them. My back was against the front wall of the house. Don Juan was sitting on another box, leaning against a pole that supported the ramada. I had just driven in a few minutes earlier. It had been a day-long ride in hot, humid weather. I was nervous, fidgety, and sweaty. Don Juan began talking to me as soon as I had comfortably settled down on the box. With a broad smile, he commented that overweight people hardly ever knew how to fight fatness. The smile that played on his lips gave me an inkling that he wasn't being facetious. He was just pointing out to me, in a most direct and at the same time indirect way, that I was overweight. I became so nervous that I tipped over the freight box on which I was sitting, and my back banged very hard against the thin wall of the house. The impact shook the house to its foundations. Don Juan looked at me inquiringly, but instead of asking me if I was all right, he assured me that I had not cracked the house. Then he expansively explained to me that his house was a temporary dwelling for him, that he really lived somewhere else. When I asked him where he really lived, he stared at me. His look was not belligerent, it was, rather, a firm deterrent to improper questions. I didn't comprehend what he wanted. I was about to ask the same question again, but he stopped me. "Questions of that sort are not asked around here," he said firmly. "Ask anything you wish about procedures or ideas. Whenever I'm ready to tell you where I live, if ever, I will tell you, without your having to ask me." I instantly felt rejected. My face turned red involuntarily. I was definitely offended. Don Juan's explosion of laughter added immensely to my chagrin. Not only had he rejected me, he had insulted me and then laughed at me. "I live here temporarily," he went on, unconcerned with my foul mood, "because this is a magical center. In fact, I live here because of you." That statement unraveled me. I couldn't believe it. I thought that he was probably saying that to ease my irritation at being insulted. "Do you really live here because of me?" I finally asked him, unable to contain my curiosity. "Yes," he said evenly. "I have to groom you. You are like me. I will repeat to you now what I have already told you. The quest of every Nagual, or leader, in every generation of shamans, or sorcerers, is to find a new man or woman who, like himself, shows a double energetic structure. I saw this feature in you when we were in the bus depot in Nogales. When I see your energy, I see two balls of luminosity superimposed, one on top of the other, and that feature binds us together. I can't refuse you any more than you can refuse me." His words caused a most strange agitation in me. An instant before I had been angry, now I wanted to weep. He went on, saying that he wanted to start me off on something shamans called the warrior's way, backed by the strength of the area where he lived, which was the center of very strong emotions and reactions. Warlike people had lived there for thousands of years, soaking the land with their concern with war. He lived at that time in the state of Sonora in northern Mexico, about 100 miles south of the city of Güemes. I always went there to visit him under the auspices of conducting my fieldwork. "Do I need to enter into war, Don Juan?" I asked, genuinely worried after he declared that the concern with war was something that I would need someday. I had already learned to take everything he said with the utmost seriousness. "You bet your boots," he replied, smiling. "When you have absorbed all there is to be absorbed in this area, I'll move away." I had no grounds to doubt what he was saying, but I couldn't conceive of him as living anywhere else. He was absolutely part of everything that surrounded him. His house, however, seemed indeed to be a temporary dwelling. It was a shack typical of the Yaqui farmers. It was made out of wattle and daub with a flat thatched roof. It had one big room for eating and sleeping and a roofless kitchen. It's very difficult to deal with overweight people, he said. It seemed to be a non sequitur, but it wasn't. Don Juan was simply going back to the subject he had introduced before I had interrupted him by hitting my back on the wall of his house. "A minute ago, you hit my house like a demolition ball," he said, shaking his head slowly from side to side. "What an impact. An impact worthy of a portly man." I had the uncomfortable feeling that he was talking to me from the point of view of someone who had given up on me. I immediately took on a defensive attitude. He listened, smirking, to my frantic explanations that my weight was normal for my bone structure. "That's right," he conceded facetiously. "You have big bones. You could probably carry 30 more pounds with great ease, and no one, I assure you, no one, would notice." I would not notice. His mocking smile told me that I was definitely pudgy. He asked me then about my health in general, and I went on talking, desperately trying to get out of any further comment about my weight. He changed the subject himself. "What's new about your eccentricities and aberrations?" he asked with a deadpan expression. I idiotically answered that they were okay. Eccentricities and aberrations was how he labeled my interest in being a collector. At that time, I had taken up, with renewed zeal, something that I had enjoyed doing all my life: collecting anything collectible. I collected magazines, stamps, records, World War II paraphernalia such as daggers, military helmets, flags, etc. All I can tell you, Don Juan, about my aberrations is that I'm trying to sell my collections, I said with the air of a martyr who is being forced to do something odious. "To be a collector is not such a bad idea," he said as if he really believed it. "The crux of the matter is not that you collect, but what you collect. You collect junk, worthless objects that imprison you as surely as your pet dog does. You can't just up and leave if you have your pet to look after, or if you have to worry about what would happen to your collections if you were not around. I'm seriously looking for buyers, Don Juan, believe me," I protested. No, don't feel that I'm accusing you of anything," he retorted. "In fact, I like your collector's spirit. I just don't like your collections, that's all. I would like, though, to engage your collector's eye. I would like to propose to you a worthwhile collection." Don Juan paused for a long moment. He seemed to be in search of words, or perhaps it was only a dramatic, well-placed hesitation. He looked at me with a deep, penetrating stare. "Every warrior, as a matter of duty, collects a special album," Don Juan went on. "An album that reveals the warrior's personality, an album that attests to the circumstances of his life." "Why do you call this a collection, Don Juan?" I asked in an argumentative tone. "Or an album, for that matter?" "Because it is both," he retorted. "But above all, it is like an album of pictures made out of memories, pictures made out of the recollection of memorable events." "Are those memorable events memorable in some specific way?" I asked. "They are memorable because they have a special significance in one's life," he said. "My proposal is that you assemble this album by putting in it the complete account of various events that have had profound significance for you." "Every event in my life has had profound significance for me, Don Juan," I said forcefully, and felt instantly the impact of my own pomposity. "Not really," he replied, smiling, apparently enjoying my reactions immensely. "Not every event in your life has had profound significance for you. There are a few, however, that I would consider likely to have changed things for you, to have illuminated your path. Ordinarily, events that change our path are impersonal affairs, and yet are extremely personal. I'm not trying to be difficult, Don Juan, but believe me, everything that has happened to me meets those qualifications, I said, knowing that I was lying. Immediately after voicing this statement, I wanted to apologize, but Don Juan didn't pay attention to me. It was as if I hadn't said a thing. Don't think about this album in terms of banalities, or in terms of a trivial rehashing of your life experiences, he said. I took a deep breath, closed my eyes, and tried to quiet my mind. I was talking to myself frantically about my insoluble problem. I most certainly didn't like to visit Don Juan at all. In his presence, I felt threatened. He verbally accosted me and didn't leave me any room whatsoever to show my worth. I detested losing face every time I opened my mouth. I detested being the fool. But there was another voice inside me. A voice that came from a greater depth, more distant, almost faint. In the midst of my barrages of known dialogue, I heard myself saying that it was too late for me to turn back. But it wasn't really my voice or my thoughts that I was experiencing, it was, rather, like an unknown voice that said I was too far gone into Don Juan's world, and that I needed him more than I needed air. Say whatever you wish, the voice seemed to say to me, but if you were not the egomaniac that you are, you wouldn't be so chagrined. That's the voice of your other mind, Don Juan said, just as if he had been listening to or reading my thoughts. My body jumped involuntarily. My fright was so intense that tears came to my eyes. I confessed to Don Juan the whole nature of my turmoil. Your conflict is a very natural one, he said. And believe you me, I don't exacerbate it that much. I'm not the type. I have some stories to tell you about what my teacher, the Nagual Julian, used to do to me. I detested him with my entire being. I was very young, and I saw how women adored him, gave themselves to him like anything. And when I tried to say hello to them, they would turn against me like lionesses, ready to bite my head off. They hated my guts and loved him. How do you think I felt? How did you resolve this conflict, Don Juan? I asked with more than genuine interest. I didn't resolve anything, he declared. The conflict or whatever, was the result of the battle between my two minds. Every one of us human beings has two minds. One is totally ours, and it is like a feigned voice that always brings us order, directness, purpose. The other mind is a foreign installation. It brings us conflict, self-assertion, doubts, hopelessness. My fixation on my own mental concatenations was so intense that I completely missed what Don Juan had said. I could clearly remember every one of his words, but they had no meaning for me. Don Juan very calmly, and looking directly into my eyes, repeated what he had just said. I was still incapable of grasping what he meant. I couldn't focus my attention on his words. For some strange reason, Don Juan, I can't concentrate on what you're telling me, I said. I understand perfectly why you can't, he said, smiling expansively, and so will you, someday, at the same time that you resolve the conflict of whether you like me or not, the day you cease to be the me center of the world. In the meantime, he continued, let's put the topic of our two minds aside and go back to the idea of preparing your album of memorable events. I should add that such an album is an exercise in discipline and impartiality. Consider this album to be an act of war. Don Juan's assertion that my conflict of both liking and not liking to see him was going to end whenever I abandoned my egocentrism was no solution for me. In fact, that assertion made me angrier. It frustrated me all the more. And when I heard Don Juan speak of the album as an act of war, I lashed out at him with all my poison. The idea that this is a collection of events is already hard to understand, I said in a tone of protest. But that on top of all this, you call it an album, and say that such an album is an act of war is too much for me. It's too obscure. Being obscure makes the metaphor lose its meaning. How strange. It's the opposite for me, Don Juan replied calmly. Such an album being an act of war has all the meaning in the world for me. I wouldn't like my album of memorable events to be anything but an act of war. I wanted to argue my point further and explain to him that I did understand the idea of an album of memorable events. I objected to the perplexing way he was describing it. I thought of myself in those days as an advocate of clarity and functionalism in the use of language. Don Juan didn't comment on my belligerent mood. He only shook his head as if he were fully agreeing with me. After a while, I either completely ran out of energy or I got a gigantic surge of it. All of a sudden, without any effort on my part, I realized the futility of my outbursts. I felt embarrassed no end. What possesses me to act the way I do? I asked Don Juan in earnest. I was, at that instant, utterly baffled. I was so shaken by my realization that without any volition on my part, I began to weep. Don't worry about stupid details, Don Juan said reassuringly. Every one of us, male and female, is like this. Do you mean, Don Juan, that we are naturally petty and contradictory? No, we are not naturally petty and contradictory, he replied. Our pettiness and contradictions are, rather, the result of a transcendental conflict that afflicts every one of us, but of which only sorcerers are painfully and hopelessly aware. The conflict of our two minds. Don Juan peered at me. His eyes were like two black charcoals. You've been telling me on and on about our two minds, I said, but my brain can't register what you are saying. Why? You'll get to know why in due time, he said. For the present, it will be sufficient that I repeat to you what I have said before about our two minds. One is our true mind, the product of all our life experiences, the one that rarely speaks because it has been defeated and relegated to obscurity. The other, the mind we use daily for everything we do, is a foreign installation. I think that the crux of the matter is that the concept of the mind being a foreign installation is so outlandish that my mind refuses to take it seriously, I said, feeling that I had made a real discovery. Don Juan did not comment on what I had said. He continued explaining the issue of the two minds as if I hadn't said a word. To resolve the conflict of the two minds is a matter of intending it, he said. Sorcerers beckon intent by voicing the word intent loud and clear. Intent is a force that exists in the universe. When sorcerers beckon intent, it comes to them and sets up the path for attainment, which means that sorcerers always accomplish what they set out to do. Do you mean, Don Juan, that sorcerers get anything they want, even if it is something petty and arbitrary? I asked. No, I didn't mean that. Intent can be called, of course, for anything, he replied, but sorcerers have found out, the hard way, that intent comes to them only for something that is abstract. That's the safety valve for sorcerers, otherwise they would be unbearable. In your case, beckoning intent to resolve the conflict of your two minds, or to hear the voice of your true mind, is not a petty or arbitrary matter. Quite the contrary, it is ethereal and abstract, and yet as vital to you as anything can be. Don Juan paused for a moment, then he began to talk again about the album. My own album, being an act of war, demanded a super careful selection, he said. It is now a precise collection of the unforgettable moments of my life and everything that led me to them. I have concentrated in it what has been and will be meaningful to me. In my opinion, a warrior's album is something most concrete, something so to the point that it is shattering. I had no clue as to what Don Juan wanted, and yet I did understand him to perfection. He advised me to sit down, alone, and let my thoughts, memories, and ideas come to me freely. He recommended that I make an effort to let the voice from the depths of me speak out and tell me what to select. Don Juan told me then to go inside the house and lie down on a bed that I had there. It was made of wooden boxes and dozens of empty burlap sacks that served as a mattress. My whole body ached, and when I lay on the bed it was actually extremely comfortable. I took his suggestions to heart and began to think about my past, looking for events that had left a mark on me. I soon realized that my assertion that every event in my life had been meaningful was nonsense. As I pressed myself to recollect, I found that I didn't even know where to start. Through my mind ran endless disassociated thoughts and memories of events that had happened to me, but I couldn't decide whether or not they had had any meaning for me. The impression I got was that nothing had had any significance whatsoever. It looked as if I had gone through life like a corpse empowered to walk and talk, but not to feel anything. Having no concentration whatsoever to pursue the subject beyond a shallow attempt, I gave up and fell asleep. Did you have any success? Don Juan asked me when I woke up hours later. Instead of being at ease after sleeping and resting, I was again moody and belligerent. No, I didn't have any success. I barked. Did you hear that voice from the depths of you? He asked. I think I did, I lied. What did it say to you? He inquired in an urgent tone. I can't think of it, Don Juan, I muttered. Ah, you are back in your daily mind, he said and patted me forcefully on the back. Your daily mind has taken over again. Let's relax it by talking about your collection of memorable events. I should tell you that the selection of what to put in your album is not an easy matter. This is the reason I say that making this album is an act of war. You have to remake yourself 10 times over in order to know what to select. I clearly understood then, if only for a second, that I had two minds. However, the thought was so vague that I lost it instantly. What remained was just the sensation of an incapacity to fulfill Don Juan's requirement. Instead of graciously accepting my incapacity, though, I allowed it to become a threatening affair. The driving force of my life, in those days, was to appear always in a good light. To be incompetent was the equivalent of being a loser, something that was thoroughly intolerable to me. Since I didn't know how to respond to the challenge Don Juan was posing, I did the only thing I knew how to do. I got angry. I've got to think a great deal more about this, Don Juan, I said. I've got to give my mind some time to settle on the idea. Of course, Don Juan assured me. Take all the time in the world, but hurry. Nothing else was said about the subject at that time. At home, I forgot about it completely until one day when, quite abruptly, in the middle of a lecture I was attending, the imperious command to search for the memorable events of my life hit me like a bodily jolt, a nervous spasm that shook my entire body from head to toe. I began to work in earnest. It took me months to rehash experiences in my life that I believed were meaningful to me. However, upon examining my collection, I realized that I was dealing only with ideas that had no substance whatsoever. The events I remembered were just vague points of reference that I remembered abstractly. Once again, I had the most unsettling suspicion that I had been reared just to act without ever stopping to feel anything. One of the vaguest events I recalled, which I wanted to make memorable at any cost, was the day I found out I had been admitted to graduate school at UCLA. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't remember what I had been doing that day. There was nothing interesting or unique about that day, except for the idea that it had to be memorable. Entering graduate school should have made me happy or proud of myself, but it didn't. Another sample in my collection was the day I almost got married to Kay Condor. Her last name wasn't really Condor, but she had changed it because she wanted to be an actress. Her ticket to fame was that she actually looked like Carole Lombard. That day was memorable in my mind, not so much because of the events that took place, but because she was beautiful and wanted to marry me. She was a head taller than I was, which made her all the more interesting to me. I was thrilled with the idea of marrying a tall woman in a church ceremony. I rented a gray tuxedo. The pants were quite wide for my height. They were not bell bottoms, they were just wide, and that bothered me no end. Another thing that annoyed me immensely was that the sleeves of the pink shirt I had bought for the occasion were about 3 inches too long. I had to use rubber bands to hold them up. Outside of that, everything was perfect until the moment when the guests and I found out that Kay Condor had gotten cold feet and wasn't going to show up. Being a very proper young lady, she had sent me a note of apology by motorcycle messenger. She wrote that she didn't believe in divorce and couldn't commit herself for the rest of her days to someone who didn't quite share her views on life. She reminded me that I snickered every time I said the name Condor, something that showed a total lack of respect for her person. She said that she had discussed the matter with her mother. Both of them loved me dearly, but not enough to make me part of their family. She added that, bravely and wisely, we all had to cut our losses. My state of mind was one of total numbness. When I tried to recollect that day, I couldn't remember whether I felt horribly humiliated at being left standing in front of a lot of people in my gray rented tuxedo with the wide-legged pants, or whether I was crushed because Kay Condor didn't marry me. These were the only two events I was capable of isolating with clarity. They were meager examples, but after rehashing them, I had succeeded in redressing them as tales of philosophical acceptance. I thought of myself as a being who goes through life with no real feelings, who has only intellectual views of everything. Taking Don Juan's metaphors as models, I even constructed one of my own. A being who lives his life vicariously in terms of what it should be. I believed, for instance, that the day I was admitted to graduate school at UCLA should have been a memorable day. Since it wasn't, I tried my best to imbue it with an importance I was far from feeling. A similar thing happened with the day I nearly married Kay Condor. It should have been a devastating day for me, but it wasn't. At the moment of recollecting it, I knew that there was nothing there and began to work as hard as I could to construct what I should have felt. The next time I went to Don Juan's house, I presented to him my 2 samples of memorable events as soon as I arrived. "This is a pile of nonsense," he declared. "None of it will do. The stories are related exclusively to you as a person who thinks, feels, cries, or doesn't feel anything at all. The memorable events of a shaman's album are affairs that will stand the test of time because they have nothing to do with him, and yet he is in the thick of them. He'll always be in the thick of them for the duration of his life and perhaps beyond, but not quite personally." His words left me feeling dejected, totally defeated. I sincerely believed in those days that Don Juan was an intransigent old man who found special delight in making me feel stupid. He reminded me of a master craftsman I had met at a sculptor's foundry where I worked while going to art school. The master artisan used to criticize and find flaws with everything his advanced apprentices did and would demand that they correct their work according to his recommendations. His apprentices would turn around and pretend to correct their work. I remembered the glee of the master when he would say, upon being presented with the same work, "Now you have a real thing." "Don't feel bad," Don Juan said, shaking me out of my recollection. In my time, I was in the same spot. For years, not only did I not know what to choose, I thought I had no experiences to choose from. It seemed that nothing had ever happened to me. Of course, everything had happened to me, but in my effort to defend the idea of myself, I had no time or inclination to notice anything. "Can you tell me, Don Juan, specifically, what is wrong with my stories? I know that they are nothing, but the rest of my life is just like that." "I will repeat this to you," he said. "The stories of a warrior's album are not personal. Your story of the day you were admitted to school is nothing but your assertion about you as the center of everything. You feel, you don't feel, you realize, you don't realize. Do you see what I mean? All of the story is just you." "But how can it be otherwise, Don Juan?" I asked. "In your other story, you almost touch on what I want, but you turn it again into something extremely personal. I know that you could add more details, but all those details would be an extension of your person and nothing else." "I sincerely cannot see your point, Don Juan," I protested. "Every story seen through the eyes of the witness has to be, perforce, personal." Yes, of course," he said, smiling, delighted as usual by my confusion. "But then they are not stories for a warrior's album. They are stories for other purposes. The memorable events we are after have the dark touch of the impersonal. That touch permeates them. I don't know how else to explain this. I believed then that I had a moment of inspiration, and that I understood what he meant by the dark touch of the impersonal. I thought that he meant something a bit morbid. Darkness meant that for me. And I related to him a story from my childhood. One of my older cousins was in medical school. He was an intern, and one day he took me to the morgue. He assured me that a young man owed it to himself to see dead people, because that sight was very educational. It demonstrated the transitoriness of life. He harangued me, on and on, in order to convince me to go. The more he talked about how unimportant we were in death, the more curious I became. I had never seen a corpse. My curiosity, in the end, to see one overwhelmed me and I went with him. He showed me various corpses and succeeded in scaring me stiff. I found nothing educational or illuminating about them. They were, outright, the most frightening things I had ever seen. As he talked to me, he kept looking at his watch, as if he were waiting for someone who was going to show up at any moment. He obviously wanted to keep me in the morgue longer than my strength permitted. Being the competitive creature that I was, I believed that he was testing my endurance, my manhood. I clenched my teeth and made up my mind to stay until the bitter end. The bitter end came in ways that I had not dreamed of. A corpse that was covered with a sheet actually moved up with a rattle on the marble table where all the corpses were lying, as if it were getting ready to sit up. It made a burping sound that was so awful it burned through me and will remain in my memory for the rest of my life. My cousin, the doctor, the scientist, explained that it was the corpse of a man who had died of tuberculosis, and that his lungs had been eaten away by bacilli that had left enormous holes filled with air, and that in cases like this, when the air changed temperature, it sometimes forced the body to sit up or at least convulse. "No, you haven't gotten it yet," Don Juan said, shaking his head from side to side. "It is merely a story about your fear." I would have been scared to death myself. However, being scared like that doesn't illuminate anyone's path. "But I'm curious to know what happened to you." "I yelled like a banshee," I said. My cousin called me a coward, a yellow belly, for hiding my face against his chest, and for getting sick to my stomach all over him. I had definitely hooked onto a morbid strand in my life. I came up with another story about a 16-year-old boy I knew in high school who had a glandular disease and grew to a gigantic height. His heart did not grow at the same rate as the rest of his body, and one day he died of heart failure. I went with another boy to the mortuary out of morbid curiosity. The mortician, who was perhaps more morbid than the two of us, opened the back door and let us in. He showed us his masterpiece. He had put the gigantic boy, who had been over 7 feet, 7 inches tall, into a coffin for a normal person by sawing off his legs. He showed us how he had arranged his legs, as if the dead boy were holding them with his arms like 2 trophies. The fright I experienced was comparable to the fright I had experienced in the morgue as a child, but this new fright was not a physical reaction, it was a reaction of psychological revulsion. "You're almost there," Don Juan said. "However, your story is still too personal. It's revolting. It makes me sick, but I see great potential." Don Juan and I laughed at the horror found in situations of everyday life. By then I was hopelessly lost in the morbid strands I had caught and released. I told him then the story of my best friend, Roy Goldfuss. He actually had a Polish surname, but his friends called him Goldfuss because whatever he touched, he turned to gold. He was a great businessman. His talent for business made him a super ambitious being. He wanted to be the richest man in the world. However, he found that the competition was too tough. According to him, doing business alone he couldn't possibly compete, for instance, with the head of an Islamic sect who, at that time, got paid his weight in gold every year. The head of the sect would fatten himself as much as his body allowed him before he was weighed. Then my friend Roy lowered his sights to being the richest man in the United States. The competition in this sector was ferocious. He went down a notch. Perhaps he could be the richest man in California. He was too late for that too. He gave up hope that, with his chains of pizza and ice cream parlors, he could ever rise in the business world to compete with the established families who owned California. He settled for being the richest man in Woodland Hills, the suburb of Los Angeles where he lived. Unfortunately for him, down the street from his house lived Mr. Marsh, who owned factories that produced A1 quality mattresses all over the United States, and he was rich beyond belief. Roy's frustration knew no limits. His drive to accomplish was so intense that it finally impaired his health. One day he died from an aneurysm in his brain. His death brought, as a consequence, my third visit to a morgue or a mortuary. Roy's wife begged me, as his best friend, to make sure that the corpse was properly dressed. I went to the funeral parlor, where I was led by a male secretary to the inner chambers. At the precise moment I arrived, the mortician, working on a high marble-topped table, was forcefully pushing up the corners of the upper lip of the corpse, which had already entered rigor mortis, with the index and little finger of his right hand, while he held his middle finger against his palm. As a grotesque smile appeared on Roy's dead face, the mortician half turned to me and said in a servile tone, "I hope all this is to your satisfaction, sir." Roy's wife, it will never be known whether she liked him or not, decided to bury him with all the garishness that, in her opinion, his life deserved. She had bought a very expensive coffin, a custom-made affair that looked like a telephone booth. She had gotten the idea from a movie. Roy was going to be buried sitting, as if he were making a business call on the telephone. I didn't stay for the ceremony. I left in the midst of a most violent reaction, a mixture of impotence and anger, the kind of anger that couldn't be vented on anyone. "You certainly are morbid today," Don Juan commented, laughing. "But in spite of that, or perhaps because of that, you're almost there. You're touching it." I never ceased to marvel at the way in which my mood changed every time I went to see Don Juan. I always arrived moody, grouchy, filled with self-assertions and doubts. After a while, my mood would mysteriously change, and I would become more expansive, by degrees, until I was as calm as I had ever been. However, my new mood was couched in my old vocabulary. My usual way of talking was that of a totally dissatisfied person who is containing himself from complaining out loud, but whose endless complaints are implied at every turn of the conversation. "Can you give me an example of a memorable event from your album, Don Juan?" I asked in my habitual tone of veiled complaint. If I knew the pattern you were after, I might be able to come up with something. As it is, I am whistling hopelessly in the dark. "Don't explain yourself so much," Don Juan said with a stern look in his eyes. "Sorcerers say that in every explanation there is a hidden apology. So, when you are explaining why you cannot do this or that, you're really apologizing for your shortcomings, hoping that whoever is listening to you will have the kindness to understand them." My most useful maneuver, when I was attacked, had always been to turn my attackers off by not listening to them. Don Juan, however, had the disgusting ability to trap every bit of my attention. No matter how he attacked me, no matter what he said, he always managed to have me riveted to his every word. On this occasion, what he was saying about me didn't please me at all because it was the naked truth. I avoided his eyes. I felt, as usual, defeated, but it was a peculiar defeat this time. It didn't bother me as it would have if it had happened in the world of everyday life, or right after I had arrived at his house. After a very long silence, Don Juan spoke to me again. "I'll do better than give you an example of a memorable event from my album," he said. I'll give you a memorable event from your own life, one that should go for sure in your collection. Or, I should say, if I were you, I would certainly put it in my collection of memorable events." I thought Don Juan was joking and I laughed stupidly. "This is not a laughing matter," he said cuttingly. "I am serious. You once told me a story that fits the bill." "What story is that, Don Juan?" "The story of figures in front of a mirror," he said. "Tell me that story again. But tell it to me in all the detail you can remember." I began to retell the story in a cursory fashion. He stopped me and demanded a careful, detailed narration, starting at the beginning. I tried again, but my rendition didn't satisfy him. "Let's go for a walk," he proposed. "When you walk, you are much more accurate than when you're sitting down. It is not an idle idea that you should pace back and forth when you try to relate something." We had been sitting, as we usually did during the day, under the house ramada. I had developed a pattern. Whenever I sat there, I always did it on the same spot, with my back against a wall. Don Juan sat in various places under the ramada, but never on the same spot. We went for a hike at the worst time of the day, noon. He outfitted me with an old straw hat, as he always did whenever we went out in the heat of the sun. We walked for a long time in complete silence. I tried to the best of my ability to force myself to remember all the details of the story. It was mid-afternoon when we sat down under the shade of some tall bushes, and I retold the full story. Years before, while I was studying sculpture in a fine arts school in Italy, I had a close friend, a Scotsman who was studying art in order to become an art critic. What stood out most vividly in my mind about him, and had to do with the story I was telling Don Juan, was the bombastic idea he had of himself. He thought he was the most licentious, lusty, all-around scholar and craftsman, a man of the Renaissance. Licentious he was, but lustiness was something in complete contradiction to his bony, dry, serious person. He was a vicarious follower of the English philosopher Bertrand Russell, and dreamed of applying the principles of logical positivism to art criticism. To be an all-around scholar and craftsman was perhaps his wildest fantasy because he was a procrastinator. Work was his nemesis. His dubious specialty wasn't art criticism, but his personal knowledge of all the prostitutes of the local bordellos, of which there were plenty. The colorful and lengthy accounts he used to give me in order to keep me, according to him, up to date about all the marvelous things he did in the world of his specialty were delightful. It was not surprising to me, therefore, that one day he came to my apartment, all excited, nearly out of breath, and told me that something extraordinary had happened to him, and that he wanted to share it with me. I say, "Old man, you must see this for yourself," he said excitedly in the Oxford accent he affected every time he talked to me. He paced the room nervously. "It's hard to describe, but I know it's something you will appreciate. Something, the impression of which will last you for a lifetime. I am going to give you a marvelous gift for life. Do you understand?" I understood that he was a hysterical Scotsman. It was always my pleasure to humor him and tag along. I had never regretted it. Calm down, Eddie," I said. "What are you trying to tell me?" He related to me that he had been in a bordello, where he had found an unbelievable woman who did an incredible thing she called figures in front of a mirror. He assured me repeatedly, almost stuttering, that I owed it to myself to experience this unbelievable event personally. I say, "Don't worry about money," he said, since he knew I didn't have any. "I've already paid the price. All you have to do is go with me. Madame Ludmilla will show you her figures in front of a mirror. It's a blast." In a fit of uncontrollable glee, Eddie laughed uproariously, oblivious to his bad teeth, which he normally hid behind a tight-lipped smile or laugh. "I say, it's absolutely great." My curiosity mounted by the minute. I was more than willing to participate in his new delight. Eddie drove me to the outskirts of the city. We stopped in front of a dusty, badly kept building. The paint was peeling off the walls. It had the air of having been a hotel at one time, a hotel that had been turned into an apartment building. I could see the remnants of a hotel sign that seemed to have been ripped to pieces. On the front of the building there were rows of dirty single balconies filled with flower pots or draped with carpets put out to dry. At the entrance to the building were two dark, shady-looking men wearing pointed black shoes that seemed too tight on their feet. They greeted Eddie effusively. They had black, shifty, menacing eyes. Both of them were wearing shiny light blue suits, also too tight for their bulky bodies. One of them opened the door for Eddie. They didn't even look at me. We went up 2 flights of stairs on a dilapidated staircase that at one time must have been luxurious. Eddie led the way and walked the length of an empty, hotel-like corridor with doors on both sides. All the doors were painted in the same drab, dark, olive green. Every door had a brass number, tarnished with age, barely visible against a painted wood. Eddie stopped in front of a door. I noticed a number 22 on it. He rapped repeatedly. The door opened, and a round, short woman with bleached blonde hair beckoned us in without saying a word. She was wearing a red silk robe with feathery, flouncy sleeves and red slippers with furry balls on top. Once we were inside a small hall and she had closed the door behind us, she greeted Eddie in terribly accented English. "Hello, Eddie. You brought friend, eh?" Eddie shook her hand and then kissed it gallantly. He acted as if he were most calm, yet I noticed his unconscious gestures of being ill at ease. "How are you today, Madame Ludmilla?" he said, trying to sound like an American and flubbing it. I never discovered why Eddie always wanted to sound like an American whenever he was transacting business in those houses of ill repute. I had the suspicion that he did it because Americans were known to be wealthy, and he wanted to establish his rich man's bona fides with them. Eddie turned to me and said in his phony American accent, "I leave you in good hands, kiddo." He sounded so awful, so foreign to my ears, that I laughed out loud. Madame Ludmilla didn't seem perturbed at all by my explosion of mirth. Eddie kissed Madame Ludmilla's hand again and left. "You speak English, my boy?" she shouted as if I were deaf. "You look Egyptian, or perhaps Turkish." I assured Madame Ludmilla that I was neither, and that I did speak English. She asked me then if I fancied her figures in front of a mirror. I didn't know what to say. I just shook my head affirmatively. "I give you good show," she assured me. "Figures in front of a mirror is only foreplay. When you are hot and ready, tell me to stop." From the small hall where we were standing we walked into a dark and eerie room. The windows were heavily curtained. There were some low-voltage light bulbs on fixtures attached to the wall. The bulbs were shaped like tubes and protruded straight out at right angles from the wall. There was a profusion of objects around the room. Pieces of furniture like small chests of drawers, antique tables and chairs, a roll-top desk set against a wall and crammed with papers, pencils, rulers, and at least a dozen pairs of scissors. Madame Ludmilla made me sit down on an old stuffed chair. "The bed is in the other room, darling," she said, pointing to the other side of the room. "This is my antesala. Here I give show to get you hot and ready." She dropped her red robe, kicked off her slippers, and opened the double doors of two armoires standing side by side against a wall. Attached to the inside of each door was a full-length mirror. "And now the music, my boy," Madame Ludmilla said, then cranked a Victrola that appeared to be in mint condition, shiny, like new. She put on a record. The music was a haunting melody that reminded me of a circus march. "And now my show," she said, and began to twirl around to the accompaniment of the haunting melody. The skin of Madame Ludmilla's body was tight, for the most part, and extraordinarily white, though she was not young. She must have been in her well-lived late 40s. Her belly sagged, not a great deal, but a bit, and so did her voluminous breasts. The skin of her face also sagged into noticeable jowls. She had a small nose and heavily painted red lips. She wore thick black mascara. She brought to mind the prototype of an aging prostitute. Yet there was something childlike about her, a girlish abandon and trust, a sweetness that jolted me. "And now, figures in front of a mirror," Madame Ludmilla announced while the music continued. "Leg, leg, leg," she said, kicking one leg up in the air, and then the other, in time with the music. She had her right hand on top of her head, like a little girl who is not sure that she can perform the movements. "Turn, turn, turn," she said, turning like a top. But, she said then, showing me her bare behind like a cancan dancer. She repeated the sequence over and over until the music began to fade when the Victrola's spring wound down. I had the feeling that Madame Ludmilla was twirling away into the distance, becoming smaller and smaller as the music faded. Some despair and loneliness that I didn't know existed in me came to the surface from the depths of my very being and made me get up and run out of the room, down the stairs like a madman, out of the building, into the street. Eddie was standing outside the door talking to the two men in light blue shiny suits. Seeing me running like that, he began to laugh uproariously. "Wasn't it a blast?" he said, still trying to sound like an American. "Figures in front of a mirror is only the foreplay. What a thing. What a thing. I see this as a sad story, Don Juan, but that's all," I declared. "It's indeed a sad story, just like your other stories," Don Juan replied, "but what makes it different and memorable to me is that it touches every one of us human beings, not just you, like your other tales. You see, like Madame Ludmilla, every one of us, young and old alike, is making figures in front of a mirror in one way or another. Tally what you know about people. Think of any human being on this earth, and you will know, without the shadow of a doubt, that no matter who they are, or what they think of themselves, or what they do, the result of their actions is always the same. Senseless figures in front of a mirror. A journey of power." At the time I met Don Juan, I was a fairly studious anthropology student, and I wanted to begin my career as a professional anthropologist by publishing as much as possible. I was bent on climbing the academic ladder, and in my calculations, I had determined that the first step was to collect data on the uses of medicinal plants by the Indians of the southwestern United States. I first asked a professor of anthropology who had worked in that area for advice about my project. He was a prominent ethnologist who had published extensively in the late 30s and early 40s on the California Indians and the Indians of the Southwest and Sonora, Mexico. He patiently listened to my exposition. My idea was to write a paper, call it Ethnobotanical Data, and publish it in a journal that dealt exclusively with anthropological issues of the southwestern United States. I proposed to collect medicinal plants, take the samples to the botanical garden at UCLA to be properly identified, and then describe why and how the Indians of the Southwest used them. I envisioned collecting thousands of entries. I even envisioned publishing a small encyclopedia on the subject. The professor smiled forgivingly at me. "I don't want to dampen your enthusiasm," he said in a tired voice, "but I can't help commenting negatively on your eagerness. Eagerness is welcome in anthropology, but it must be properly channeled. We are still in the golden age of anthropology." It was my luck to study with Alfred Kroeber and Robert Lowy, two pillars of social science. I haven't betrayed their trust. Anthropology is still the master discipline. Every other discipline should stem from anthropology. The entire field of history, for example, should be called historical anthropology, and the field of philosophy should be called philosophical anthropology. Man should be the measure of everything. Therefore, anthropology, the study of man, should be the core of every other discipline. Someday, it will. I looked at him, bewildered. He was, in my estimation, a totally passive, benevolent old professor who had recently had a heart attack. I seemed to have struck a chord of passion in him. "Don't you think that you should pay more attention to your formal studies?" he continued. "Rather than doing field work, wouldn't it be better for you to study linguistics? We have in the department here one of the most prominent linguists in the world. If I were you, I'd be sitting at his feet, catching any drift emanating from him. We also have a superb authority in comparative religions. And there are some exceptionally competent anthropologists here who have done work on kinship systems in cultures all over the world, from the point of view of linguistics and from the point of view of cognition. You need a lot of preparation. To think that you could do field work now is a travesty. Plunge into your books, young man. That's my advice." Stubbornly, I took my proposition to another professor, a younger one. He wasn't in any way more helpful. He laughed at me openly. He told me that the paper I wanted to write was a Mickey Mouse paper, and that it wasn't anthropology by any stretch of the imagination. "Anthropologists nowadays," he said professorially, "are concerned with issues that have relevance. Medical and pharmaceutical scientists have done endless research on every possible medicinal plant in the world. There's no longer any bone to chew on there. Your kind of data collecting belongs to the turn of the 19th century. Now it's nearly 200 years later. There is such a thing as progress, you know." He proceeded to give me, then, a definition and a justification of progress and perfectibility as two issues of philosophical discourse, which he said were most relevant to anthropology. "Anthropology is the only discipline in existence," he continued, "which can clearly substantiate the concept of perfectibility and progress. Thank God that there's still a ray of hope in the midst of the cynicism of our times." Only anthropology can show the actual development of culture and social organization. Only anthropologists can prove to mankind beyond the shadow of a doubt the progress of human knowledge. Culture evolves, and only anthropologists can present samples of societies that fit definite cubbyholes in a line of progress and perfectibility. That's anthropology for you. Not some puny fieldwork, which is not fieldwork at all, but mere masturbation. It was a blow on the head to me. As a last resort, I went to Arizona to talk to anthropologists who were actually doing field work there. By then, I was ready to give up on the whole idea. I understood what the two professors were trying to tell me. I couldn't have agreed with them more. My attempts at doing field work were definitely simple-minded. Yet I wanted to get my feet wet in the field. I didn't want to do only library research. In Arizona, I met with an extremely seasoned anthropologist who had written copiously on the Yaqui Indians of Arizona, as well as those of Sonora, Mexico. He was extremely kind. He didn't run me down, nor did he give me any advice. He only commented that the Indian societies of the Southwest were extremely isolationist, and that foreigners, especially those of Hispanic origin, were distrusted, even abhorred, by those Indians. A younger colleague of his, however, was more outspoken. He said that I was better off reading herbalists' books. He was an authority in the field, and his opinion was that anything to be known about medicinal plants from the Southwest had already been classified and talked about in various publications. He went as far as to say that the sources of any Indian cure of the day were precisely those publications, rather than any traditional knowledge. He finished me off with the assertion that if there still were any traditional curing practices, the Indians would not divulge them to a stranger. Do something worthwhile, he advised me. Look into urban anthropology. There's a lot of money for studies on alcoholism among Indians in the big city, for example. Now that's something that any anthropologist can do easily. Go and get drunk with local Indians in a bar. Then arrange whatever you find out about them in terms of statistics. Turn everything into numbers. Urban anthropology is a real field. There was nothing else for me to do except to take the advice of those experienced social scientists. I decided to fly back to Los Angeles, but another anthropologist friend of mine let me know then that he was going to drive throughout Arizona and New Mexico, visiting all the places where he had done work in the past, renewing in this fashion his relationships with the people who had been his anthropological informants. "You're welcome to come with me," he said. "I'm not going to do any work. I'm just going to visit with them, have a few drinks with them, bullshit with them." I bought gifts for them: blankets, booze, jackets, ammunition for .22 caliber rifles. My car is loaded with goodies. I usually drive alone whenever I go to see them, but by myself I always run the risk of falling asleep. You could keep me company, keep me from dozing off, or drive a little bit if I'm too drunk. I felt so despondent that I turned him down. "I'm very sorry, Bill," I said. "The trip won't do for me. I see no point in pursuing this idea of field work any longer." "Don't give up without a fight," Bill said in a tone of paternal concern. "Give all you have to the fight, and if it licks you, then it's okay to give up, but not before. Come with me and see how you like the Southwest." He put his arm around my shoulders. I couldn't help noticing how immensely heavy his arm was. He was tall and husky, but in recent years his body had acquired a strange rigidity. He had lost his boyish quality. His round face was no longer filled, youthful, the way it had been. Now it was a worried face. I believed that he worried because he was losing his hair, but at times it seemed to me that it was something more than that. And it wasn't that he was fatter. His body was heavy in ways that were impossible to explain. I noticed it in the way that he walked, and got up, and sat down. Bill seemed to me to be fighting gravity with every fiber of his being, in everything he did. Disregarding my feelings of defeat, I started on a journey with him. We visited every place in Arizona and New Mexico where there were Indians. One of the end results of this trip was that I found out that my anthropologist friend had two definite facets to his person. He explained to me that his opinions as a professional anthropologist were very measured and congruous with the anthropological thought of the day, but that as a private person, his anthropological fieldwork had given him a wealth of experiences that he never talked about. These experiences were not congruous with the anthropological thought of the day because they were events that were impossible to catalog. During the course of our trip, he would invariably have some drinks with his ex-informants and feel very relaxed afterward. I would take the wheel then and drive as he sat in the passenger seat taking sips from his bottle of 30-year-old Ballantines. It was then that Bill would talk about his uncatalogued experiences. "I have never believed in ghosts," he said abruptly one day. "I never went in for apparitions and floating essences, voices in the dark, you know. I had a very pragmatic, serious upbringing. Science had always been my compass. But then, working in the field, all kinds of weird crap began to filter through to me. For instance, I went with some Indians one night on a vision quest. They were going to actually initiate me by some painful business of piercing the muscles of my chest. They were preparing a sweat lodge in the woods. I had resigned myself to withstand the pain. I took a couple of drinks to give me strength. And then the man who was going to intercede for me with the people who actually performed the ceremony yelled in horror and pointed at a dark, shadowy figure walking toward us. When the shadowy figure came closer to me, Bill went on, I noticed that what I had in front of me was an old Indian dressed in the weirdest getup you could imagine. He had the paraphernalia of shamans. The man I was with that night fainted shamelessly at the sight of the old man. The old man came to me and pointed a finger at my chest. His finger was just skin and bone. He babbled incomprehensible things to me. By then, the rest of the people had seen the old man and started to rush silently toward me. The old man turned to look at them, and every one of them froze. He harangued them for a moment. His voice was something unforgettable. It was as if he were talking from a tube, or as if he had something attached to his mouth that carried the words out of him. I swear to you that I saw the man talking inside his body, and his mouth broadcasting the words as a mechanical apparatus. After haranguing the men, the old man continued walking, past me, past them, and disappeared, swallowed by the darkness. Bill said that the plan to have an initiation ceremony went to pot. It was never performed, and the men, including the shamans in charge, were shaking in their boots. He stated that they were so frightened that they disbanded and left. People who had been friends for years, he went on, never spoke to each other again. They claimed that what they had seen was the apparition of an incredibly old shaman, and that it would bring bad luck to talk about it among themselves. In fact, they said that the mere act of setting eyes on one another would bring them bad luck. Most of them moved away from the area. Why did they feel that talking to each other or seeing each other would bring them bad luck? I asked him. Those are their beliefs, he replied. A vision of that nature means to them that the apparition spoke to each of them individually. To have a vision of that nature is, for them, the luck of a lifetime. And what was the individual thing that the vision told each of them? I asked. Beats me, he replied. They never explained anything to me. Every time I asked them, they entered into a profound state of numbness. They hadn't seen anything, they hadn't heard anything. Years after the event, the man who had fainted next to me swore to me that he had just faked the faint because he was so frightened that he didn't want to face the old man, and that what he had to say was understood by everybody at a level other than language comprehension. Bill said that in his case, what the apparition voiced to him he understood as having to do with his health and his expectations in life. What do you mean by that? I asked him. Things are not that good for me, he confessed. My body doesn't feel well. But do you know what is really the matter with you? I asked. Oh, yes, he said nonchalantly. Doctors have told me. But I'm not gonna worry about it, or even think about it. Bill's revelations left me feeling thoroughly uneasy. This was a facet of his person that I didn't know. I had always thought that he was a tough old cookie. I could never conceive of him as vulnerable. I didn't like our exchange. It was, however, too late for me to retreat. Our trip continued. On another occasion, he confided that the shamans of the Southwest were capable of transforming themselves into different entities, and that the categorization schemes of bear shaman or mountain lion shaman, etc., should not be taken as euphemisms or metaphors because they were not. Would you believe it, he said in a tone of great admiration, that there are some shamans who actually become bears, or mountain lions, or eagles. I'm not exaggerating, nor am I fabricating anything when I say that once I witnessed a transformation of a shaman who called himself River Man, or River Shaman, or proceeding from river, returning to river. I was out in the mountains of New Mexico with this shaman. I was driving for him, he trusted me, and he was going in search of his origin, or so he said. We were walking along a river when he suddenly got very excited. He told me to move away from the shore to some high rocks and hide there, put a blanket over my head and shoulders, and peek through it so I would not miss what he was about to do. What was he going to do? I asked him, incapable of containing myself. I didn't know, he said. Your guess would have been as good as mine. I had no way of conceiving of what he was going to do. He just walked into the water, fully dressed. When the water reached him at mid-calf, because it was a wide but shallow river, the shaman simply vanished, disappeared. Prior to entering the water, he had whispered in my ear that I should go downstream and wait for him. He told me the exact spot to wait. I, of course, didn't believe a word of what he was saying, so at first I couldn't remember where he had said I had to wait for him, but then I found the spot, and I saw the shaman coming out of the water. It sounds stupid to say coming out of the water. I saw the shaman turning into water and then being remade out of the water. Can you believe that? I had no comments on his stories. It was impossible for me to believe him, but I could not disbelieve him either. He was a very serious man. The only possible explanation that I could think of was that as we continued our trip he drank more and more every day. He had in the trunk of the car a box of 24 bottles of scotch for only himself. He actually drank like a fish. I have always been partial to the esoteric mutations of shamans, he said to me another day. It's not that I can explain the mutations or even believe that they take place, but as an intellectual exercise, I am very interested in considering that mutations into snakes and mountain lions are not as difficult as what the water shaman did. It is at moments like this, when I engage my intellect in such a fashion, that I cease to be an anthropologist and I begin to react, following a gut feeling. My gut feeling is that those shamans certainly do something that can't be measured scientifically or even talked about intelligently. For instance, there are cloud shamans who turn into clouds, into mist. I have never seen this happen, but I knew a cloud shaman. I never saw him disappearing or turning into mist in front of my eyes, as I saw that other shaman turning into water right in front of me. But I chased that cloud shaman once, and he simply vanished in an area where there was no place for him to hide. Although I didn't see him turning into a cloud, he disappeared. I couldn't explain where he went. There were no rocks or vegetation around the place where he ended up. I was there half a minute after he was, but the shaman was gone. I chased that man all over the place for information, Bill went on. He wouldn't give me the time of day. He was very friendly to me, but that was all. Bill told me endless other stories about strife and political factions among Indians in different Indian reservations, or stories about personal vendettas, animosities, friendships, etc., which did not interest me in the least. On the other hand, his stories about shamans' mutations and apparitions had caused a true emotional upheaval in me. I was at once both fascinated and appalled by them. However, when I tried to think about why I was fascinated or appalled, I couldn't tell. All I could have said was that his stories about shamans hit me at an unknown, visceral level. Another realization brought by this trip was that I verified for myself that the Indian societies of the Southwest were indeed closed to outsiders. I finally came to accept that I did need a great deal of preparation in the science of anthropology, and that it was more functional to do anthropological fieldwork in an area with which I was familiar or one in which I had an entree. When the journey ended, Bill drove me to the Greyhound bus depot in Nogales, Arizona, for my return trip to Los Angeles. As we were sitting in the waiting area before the bus came, he consoled me in a paternal manner, reminding me that failures were a matter of course in anthropological fieldwork, and that they meant only the hardening of one's purpose or the coming to maturity of an anthropologist. Abruptly, he leaned over and pointed with a slight movement of his chin to the other side of the room. "I think that old man sitting on the bench by the corner over there is the man I told you about," he whispered in my ear. "I am not quite sure because I've had him in front of me, face to face, only once." "What man is that? What did you tell me about him?" I asked. "When we were talking about shamans and shamans' transformations, I told you that I had once met a cloud shaman." Yes, I remember that," I said. "Is that man the cloud shaman?" "No," he said emphatically. "But I think he is a companion or a teacher of the cloud shaman. I saw both of them together in the distance various times, many years ago." I did remember Bill mentioning, in a very casual manner, but not in relation to the cloud shaman, that he knew about the existence of a mysterious old man who was a retired shaman, an old Indian misanthrope from Yuma, who had once been a terrifying sorcerer. The relationship of the old man to the cloud shaman was never voiced by my friend, but obviously it was foremost in Bill's mind, to the point where he believed that he had told me about him. A strange anxiety suddenly possessed me and made me jump out of my seat. As if I had no volition of my own, I approached the old man and immediately began a long tirade on how much I knew about medicinal plants and shamanism among the American Indians of the plains and their Siberian ancestors. As a secondary theme, I mentioned to the old man that I knew that he was a shaman. I concluded by assuring him that it would be thoroughly beneficial for him to talk to me at length. If nothing else, I said petulantly, we could swap stories. You tell me yours and I'll tell you mine. The old man kept his eyes lowered until the last moment. Then he peered at me. I am Juan Matus, he said, looking me squarely in the eyes. My tirade shouldn't have ended by any means, but for no reason that I could discern I felt that there was nothing more I could have said. I wanted to tell him my name. He raised his hand to the height of my lips as if to prevent me from saying it. At that instant, a bus pulled up to the bus stop. The old man muttered that it was the bus he had to take, then he earnestly asked me to look him up so we could talk with more ease and swap stories. There was an ironic smirk on the corner of his mouth when he said that. With an incredible agility for a man his age, I figured he must have been in his 80s. He covered, in a few leaps, the 50 yards between the bench where he was sitting and the door of the bus. As if the bus had stopped just to pick him up, it moved away as soon as he had jumped in, and the door had closed. After the old man left, I went back to the bench where Bill was sitting. What did he say? What did he say? He asked excitedly. He told me to look him up and come to his house to visit, I said. He even said that we could talk there. But what did you say to him to get him to invite you to his house? He demanded. I told Bill that I had used my best sales pitch and that I had promised the old man to reveal to him everything I knew, from the point of view of my reading, about medicinal plants. Bill obviously didn't believe me. He accused me of holding out on him. I know the people around this area, he said belligerently, and that old man is a very strange fart. He doesn't talk to anybody, Indians included. Why would he talk to you, a perfect stranger? You're not even cute. It was obvious that Bill was annoyed with me. I couldn't figure out why though. I didn't dare ask him for an explanation. He gave me the impression of being a bit jealous. Perhaps he felt that I had succeeded where he had failed. However, my success had been so inadvertent that it didn't mean anything to me. Except for Bill's casual remarks, I didn't have any conception of how difficult it was to approach that old man, and I couldn't have cared less. At the time, I found nothing remarkable in the exchange. It baffled me that Bill was so upset about it. Do you know where his house is? I asked him. I haven't the foggiest idea, he answered curtly. I have heard people from this area say that he doesn't live anywhere, that he just appears here and there unexpectedly, but that's a lot of horseshit. He probably lives in some shack in Nogales, Mexico. Why is he so important? I asked him. My question made me gather enough courage to add, you seem to be upset because he talked to me. Why? Without any ado, he admitted that he was chagrined because he knew how useless it was to try to talk to that man. That old man is as rude as anyone can be, he added. At best, he stares at you without saying a word when you talk to him. At other times, He doesn't even look at you. He treats you as if you didn't exist. The one time I tried to talk to him, he brutally turned me down. Do you know what he said to me? He said, "If I were you, I wouldn't waste my energy opening my mouth. Save it. You need it." If he weren't such an old fart, I would have punched him in the nose. I pointed out to Bill that to call him an old man was more a figure of speech than an actual description. He didn't really appear to be that old, although he was definitely old. He possessed a tremendous vigor and agility. I felt that Bill would have failed miserably if he had tried to punch him in the nose. That old Indian was powerful. In fact, he was downright scary. I didn't voice my thoughts. I let Bill go on telling me how disgusted he was at the nastiness of that old man and how he would have dealt with him had it not been for the fact that the old man was so feeble. "Who do you think could give me some information about where he might live?" I asked him. "Perhaps some people in Yuma," he replied, a bit more relaxed. "Maybe the people I introduced you to at the beginning of our trip. You wouldn't lose anything by asking them. Tell them that I sent you to them." I changed my plans right then, and instead of going back to Los Angeles, went directly to Yuma, Arizona. I saw the people to whom Bill had introduced me. They didn't know where the old Indian lived, but their comments about him inflamed my curiosity even more. They said that he was not from Yuma, but from Sonora, Mexico, and that in his youth, he had been a fearsome sorcerer who did incantations and put spells on people, but that he had mellowed with age, turning into an ascetic hermit. They remarked that although he was a Yaqui Indian, he had once run around with a group of Mexican men who seemed to be extremely knowledgeable about bewitching practices. They all agreed that they hadn't seen those men in the area for ages. One of the men added that the old man was contemporaneous with his grandfather, but that while his grandfather was senile and bedridden, the sorcerer seemed to be more vigorous than ever. The same man referred me to some people in Hermosillo, the capital of Sonora, who might know the old man and be able to tell me more about him. The prospect of going to Mexico was not at all appealing to me. Sonora was too far away from my area of interest. Besides, I reasoned that I was better off doing urban anthropology after all, and I went back to Los Angeles. But before leaving for Los Angeles, I canvassed the area of Yuma, searching for information about the old man. No one knew anything about him. As the bus drove to Los Angeles, I experienced a unique sensation. On the one hand, I felt totally cured of my obsession with field work or my interest in the old man. On the other hand, I felt a strange nostalgia. It was, truthfully, something I had never felt before. Its newness struck me profoundly. It was a mixture of anxiety and longing, as if I were missing something of tremendous importance. I had the clear sensation as I approached Los Angeles that whatever had been acting on me around Yuma had begun to fade with distance, but its fading only increased my unwarranted longing. The intent of infinity. I want you to think deliberately about every detail of what transpired between you and those two men, Jorge Campos and Lucas Coronado. Don Juan said to me, "Who are the ones who really delivered you to me, and then tell me all about it." I found his request very difficult to fulfill, and yet I actually enjoyed remembering everything those two had said to me. He wanted every detail possible, something that forced me to push my memory to its limits. The story Don Juan wanted me to recollect began in the city of Guaymas, in Sonora, Mexico. In Yuma, Arizona, I had been given the names and addresses of some people who, I was told, might be able to shed light on the mystery of the old man I had met in the bus depot. The people I went to see not only didn't know any retired old shaman, they even doubted that such a man had ever existed. They were all filled to the brim, however, with scary stories about Yaqui shamans and about the belligerent general mood of the Yaqui Indians. They insinuated that perhaps in the active Vicum, a railroad station town between the cities of Guaymas and Ciudad Obregón, I might find someone who could perhaps steer me in the proper direction. Is there anyone in particular I could look up? I asked. Your best bet would be to talk to a field inspector of the official government bank, one of the men suggested. The bank has a lot of field inspectors. They know all the Indians of the area because the bank is the government institution that buys their crops, and every Yaqui is a farmer, the proprietor of a parcel of land that he can call his own, as long as he cultivates it. Do you know any field inspectors? I asked. They looked at each other and smiled apologetically at me. They didn't know any, but strongly recommended that I should approach one of those men on my own and put my case to him. In Vicum Station, my attempts at making contact with the field inspectors of the government bank were a total disaster. I met 3 of them, and when I told them what I wanted, every one of them looked at me with utter distrust. They immediately suspected that I was a spy sent there by the Yankees to cause problems that they could not clearly define, but about which they made wild speculations ranging from political agitation to industrial espionage. It was the unsubstantiated belief of everyone around that there were copper deposits in the lands of the Yaqui Indians and that the Yankees coveted them. After this resounding failure, I retreated to the city of Guaymas and stayed at a hotel that was very close to a fabulous restaurant. I went there 3 times a day. The food was superb. I liked it so much that I stayed in Guaymas for over a week. I practically lived in the restaurant and became, in this manner, acquainted with the owner, Mr. Reyes. One afternoon while I was eating, Mr. Reyes came to my table with another man, whom he introduced to me as Jorge Campos, a full-blooded Yaqui Indian entrepreneur who had lived in Arizona in his youth, who spoke English perfectly, and who was more American than any American. Mr. Reyes praised him as a true example of how hard work and dedication could develop a person into an exceptional man. Mr. Reyes left and Jorge Campos sat down next to me and immediately took over. He pretended to be modest and denied all praise, but it was obvious that he was as pleased as punch with what Mr. Reyes had said about him. At first sight, I had the clear impression that Jorge Campos was an entrepreneur of the particular kind that one finds in bars or on crowded corners of main streets, trying to sell an idea or simply trying to find a way to con people out of their savings. Mr. Campos was very pleasant looking, around 6 feet tall and lean, but with a high pot belly like a habitual drinker of hard liquor. He had a very dark complexion, with a touch of green to it, and wore expensive blue jeans and shiny cowboy boots with pointed toes and angular heels, as if he needed to dig them into the ground to stop being dragged by a lassoed steer. He was wearing an impeccably ironed gray plaid shirt. In its right pocket was a plastic pocket guard into which he had inserted a row of pens. I had seen the same pocket guard among office workers who didn't want to stain their shirt pockets with ink. His attire also included an expensive-looking fringed reddish-brown suede jacket and a tall Texas-style cowboy hat. His round face was expressionless. He had no wrinkles even though he seemed to be in his early 50s. For some unknown reason, I believed that he was dangerous. "Very pleased to meet you, Mr. Campos," I said in Spanish, extending my hand to him. "Let's dispense with the formalities," he responded, also in Spanish, shaking my hand vigorously. "I like to treat young people as equals, regardless of age differences. Call me Jorge." He was quiet for a moment, no doubt assessing my reaction. I didn't know what to say. I certainly didn't want to humor him, nor did I want to take him seriously. "I'm curious to know what you're doing in Guaymas," he went on casually. "You don't seem to be a tourist, nor do you seem to be interested in deep-sea fishing." "I am an anthropology student," I said, "and I am trying to establish my credentials with the local Indians in order to do some field research." "And I am a businessman," he said. "My business is to supply information, to be the go-between. You have the need, I have the commodity. I charge for my services. However, my services are guaranteed. If you don't get satisfaction, you don't have to pay me." "If your business is to supply information," I said, "I will gladly pay you whatever you charge." "Ah!" he exclaimed. "You certainly need a guide, someone with more education than the average Indian here, to show you around. Do you have a grant from the United States government or from another big institution?" "Yes," I lied. "I have a grant from the Esoterical Foundation of Los Angeles." When I said that, I actually saw a glint of greed in his eyes. "Ah!" he exclaimed again. "How big is that institution?" "Fairly big," I said. "My goodness. Is that so?" he said, as if my words were an explanation that he had wanted to hear. "And now, may I ask you, if you don't mind, how big is your grant? How much money did they give you?" "A few $1,000s to do preliminary field work," I lied again, to see what he would say. "Ah. I like people who are direct," he said, relishing his words. "I am sure that you and I are going to reach an agreement. I offer you my services as a guide and as a key that can open many secret doors among the Yaquis. As you can see by my general appearance, I am a man of taste and means." "Oh, yes, definitely you are a man of good taste," I asserted. "What I am saying to you," he said, "is that for a small fee, which you will find most reasonable, I will steer you to the right people to whom you could ask any question you want. And for some very little more, I will translate their words to you, verbatim, into Spanish or English. I can also speak French and German, but I have the feeling that those languages do not interest you." "You are right, you are so very right," I said. "Those languages don't interest me at all. But how much would your fees be?" "Ah. My fees?" he said, and took a leather-covered notebook out of his back pocket and flipped it open in front of my face. He scribbled quick notes on it, flipped it closed again, and put it in his pocket with precision and speed. I was sure that he wanted to give me the impression of being efficient and fast at calculating figures. "I will charge you $50 a day," he said, "with transportation, plus my meals. I mean, when you eat, I eat. What do you say?" At that moment, he leaned over to me and, almost in a whisper, said that we should shift into English because he didn't want people to know the nature of our transactions. He began to speak to me then in something that wasn't English at all. I was at a loss. I didn't know how to respond. I began to fret nervously as the man kept on talking gibberish with the most natural air. He didn't bat an eyelash. He moved his hands in a very animated fashion and pointed around him as if he were instructing me. I didn't have the impression that he was speaking in tongues. I thought perhaps he was speaking the Yaqui language. When people came around our table and looked at us, I nodded and said to Jorge Campos, "Yes, yes, indeed." At one point I said, "You could say that again," and this sounded so funny to me that I broke into a belly laugh. He also laughed heartily, as if I had said the funniest thing possible. He must have noticed that I was finally at my wit's end, and before I could get up and tell him to get lost, he started to speak Spanish again. "I don't want to tire you with my silly observations," he said. "But if I'm going to be your guide, as I think I am going to be, we will be spending long hours chatting. I was testing you just now to see if you are a good conversationalist. If I'm going to spend time with you driving, I need someone by me who could be a good receptor and initiator. I'm glad to tell you that you are both." Then he stood up, shook my hand, and left. As if on cue, the owner came to my table, smiling and shaking his head from side to side like a little bear. "Isn't he a fabulous guy?" he asked me. I didn't want to commit myself to a statement, and Mr. Reyes volunteered that Jorge Campos was at that moment a go-between in an extremely delicate and profitable transaction. He said that some mining companies in the United States were interested in the iron and copper deposits that belonged to the Yaqui Indians, and that Jorge Campos was there, in line to collect perhaps a $5 million fee. I knew then that Jorge Campos was a con man. There were no iron or copper deposits on the lands owned by the Yaqui Indians. If there had been any, private enterprises would have already moved the Yaquis out of those lands and relocated them somewhere else. "He's fabulous," I said. "Most wonderful guy I ever met. How can I get in touch with him again?" "Don't worry about that," Mr. Reyes said. "Jorge asked me all about you. He has been watching you since you came. He'll probably come and knock on your door later today or tomorrow." Mr. Reyes was right. A couple of hours later, somebody woke me from my afternoon nap. It was Jorge Campos. I had intended to leave Guaymas in the early evening and drive, all night, to California. I explained to him that I was leaving, but that I would come back in a month or so. "Ah. But you must stay now that I have decided to be your guide," he said. "I'm sorry, but we will have to wait for this because my time is very limited now," I replied. I knew that Jorge Campos was a crook, yet I decided to reveal to him that I already had an informant who was waiting to work with me, and that I had met him in Arizona. I described the old man and said that his name was Juan Matus, and that other people had characterized him as a shaman. Jorge Campos smiled at me broadly. I asked him if he knew the old man. "Ah, yes, I know him," he said jovially. "You may say that we are good friends." Without being invited, Jorge Campos came into the room and sat down at the table just inside the balcony. "Does he live around here?" I asked. "He certainly does," he assured me. "Would you take me to him?" "I don't see why not," he said. "I would need a couple of days to make my own inquiries, just to make sure that he is there, and then we will go and see him." I knew that he was lying, yet I didn't want to believe it. I even thought that my initial distrust had perhaps been ill-founded. He seemed so convincing at that moment. However, he continued, in order to take you to see the man, I will charge you a flat fee. My honorarium will be $200. That amount was more than I had at my disposal. I politely declined and said that I didn't have enough money with me. I don't want to appear mercenary, he said with his most winning smile, but how much money can you afford? You must take into consideration that I have to do a little bribing. The Yaqui Indians are very private, but there are always ways. There are always doors that open with a magical key money. In spite of all my misgivings, I was convinced that Jorge Campos was my entry not only into the Yaqui world, but to finding the old man who had intrigued me so much. I didn't want to haggle over money. I was almost embarrassed to offer him the $50 I had in my pocket. I am at the end of my stay here, I said as a sort of apology, so I have nearly run out of money. I have only $50 left. Jorge Campos stretched his long legs under the table and crossed his arms behind his head, tipping his hat over his face. I'll take your $50 and your watch, he said shamelessly. But for that money, I will take you to meet a minor shaman. Don't get impatient, he warned me, as if I were going to protest. We must step carefully up the ladder, from the lower ranks to the man himself, who I assure you is at the very top. And when could I meet this minor shaman? I asked, handing him the money and my watch. Right now, he replied as he sat up straight and eagerly grabbed the money and the watch. Let's go. There's not a minute to waste. We got into my car and he directed me to head off for the town of Potom, one of the traditional Yaqui towns along the Yaqui River. As we drove, he revealed to me that we were going to meet Lucas Coronado, a man who was known for his sorcery feats, his shamanistic trances, and for the magnificent masks that he made for the Yaqui festivities of Lent. Then he shifted the conversation to the old man, and what he said was in total contradiction to what others had said to me about the man. While they had described him as a hermit and retired shaman, Jorge Campos portrayed him as the most prominent curer and sorcerer of the area, a man whose fame had turned him into a nearly inaccessible figure. He paused, like an actor, and then he delivered his blow. He said that to talk to the old man on a steady basis, the way anthropologists like to do, was going to cost me at least $2,000. I was going to protest such a drastic hike in price, but he anticipated me. For $200, I could take you to him, he said. Out of those $200, I would clear about 30. The rest would go for bribes. But to talk to him at length will cost more. You yourself could figure that out. He has actual bodyguards, people who protect him. I have to sweet-talk them and come up with dough for them. In the end, he continued, I will give you a total account with receipts and everything for your taxes. Then you will know that my commission for setting it all up is minimal. I felt a wave of admiration for him. He was aware of everything, even receipts for income tax. He was quiet for a while, as if calculating his minimal profit. I had nothing to say. I was busy calculating myself, trying to figure out a way to get $2,000. I even thought of really applying for a grant. But are you sure the old man would talk to me? I asked. Of course, he assured me. Not only would he talk to you, he's going to perform sorcery for you, for what you pay him. Then you could work out an agreement with him as to how much you could pay him for further lessons. Jorge Campos kept silent again for a while, peering into my eyes. "Do you think that you could pay me the $2,000? He asked in a tone so purposefully indifferent that I instantly knew it was a sham. "Oh, yes, I can easily afford that," I lied reassuringly. He could not disguise his glee. "Good boy. Good boy," he cheered. "We're going to have a ball." I tried to ask him some general questions about the old man. He forcefully cut me off. "Save all this for the man himself. He'll be all yours," he said, smiling. He began to tell me then about his life in the United States and about his business aspirations, and to my utter bewilderment, since I had already classified him as a phony who didn't speak a word of English, he shifted into English. "You do speak English?" I exclaimed without any attempt at hiding my surprise. "Of course I do, my boy," he said, affecting a Texan accent, which he carried on for the duration of our conversation. "I told you, I wanted to test you, to see if you are resourceful. You are. In fact, you are quite clever, I may say." His command of English was superb, and he delighted me with jokes and stories. In no time at all, we were in Potham. He directed me to a house on the outskirts of town. We got out of the car. He led the way, calling loudly in Spanish for Lucas Coronado. We heard a voice from the back of the house that said, also in Spanish, "Come over here." There was a man behind a small shack, sitting on the ground, on a goatskin. He was holding a piece of wood with his bare feet while he worked on it with a chisel and a mallet. By holding the piece of wood in place with the pressure of his feet, he had fashioned a stupendous potter's turning wheel, so to speak. His feet turned the piece as his hands worked the chisel. I had never seen anything like this in my life. He was making a mask, hollowing it with a curved chisel. His control of his feet in holding the wood and turning it around was remarkable. The man was very thin. He had a thin face with angular features, high cheekbones, and a dark copperish complexion. The skin of his face and neck seemed to be stretched to the maximum. He sported a thin, droopy mustache that gave his angular face a malevolent slant. He had an aquiline nose with a very thin bridge and fierce black eyes. His extremely black eyebrows appeared as if they had been drawn on with a pencil, and so did his jet black hair, combed backward on his head. I had never seen a more hostile face. The image that came to mind looking at him was that of an Italian poisoner of the era of the Medicis. The words truculent and saturnine seemed to be the most apt descriptions when I focused my attention on Lucas Coronado's face. I noticed that while he was sitting on the ground, holding the piece of wood with his feet, the bones of his legs were so long that his knees came to his shoulders. When we approached him, he stopped working and stood up. He was taller than Jorge Campos and as thin as a rail. As a gesture of deference to us, I suppose, he put on his grouches. Come in," he said without smiling. I had a strange feeling then that Lucas Coronado didn't know how to smile. "To what do I owe the pleasure of this visit?" he asked Jorge Campos. "I've brought this young man here because he wants to ask you some questions about your art," Jorge Campos said in a most patronizing tone. "I vouch that you would answer his questions truthfully." "Oh, that's no problem, Lucas Coronado assured me, sizing me up with his cold stare. He shifted into a different language then, which I presume to be Yaqui. He and Jorge Campos got into an animated conversation that lasted for some time. Both of them acted as if I did not exist. Then Jorge Campos turned to me. "We have a little problem here," he said. "Lucas has just informed me that this is a very busy season for him, since the festivities are approaching, so he won't be able to answer all the questions that you ask him, but he will at another time." "Yes, yes, most certainly," Lucas Coronado said to me in Spanish. "At another time, indeed, at another time." "We have to cut our visit short," Jorge Campos said, "but I'll bring you back again." As we were leaving, I felt moved to express to Lucas Coronado my admiration for his stupendous technique of working with his hands and feet. He looked at me as if I were mad, his eyes widening with surprise. "You've never seen anyone working on a mask?" he hissed through clenched teeth. "Where are you from? Mars?" I felt stupid. I tried to explain that his technique was quite new to me. He seemed ready to hit me on the head. Jorge Campos said to me in English that I had offended Lucas Coronado with my comments. He had understood my praise as a veiled way of making fun of his poverty. My words had been to him an ironic statement of how poor and helpless he was. "But it's the opposite," I said. "I think he's magnificent." "Don't try to tell him anything like that," Jorge Campos retorted. "These people are trained to receive and dispense insults in a most covert form. He thinks it's odd that you run him down when you don't even know him, and make fun of the fact that he cannot afford a vase to hold his sculpture." I felt totally at a loss. The last thing I wanted was to foul up my only possible contact. Jorge Campos seemed to be utterly aware of my chagrin. "Buy one of his masks," he advised me. I told him that I intended to drive to Los Angeles in one lap, without stopping, and that I had just sufficient money to buy gasoline and food. "Well, give him your leather jacket," he said matter-of-factly, but in a confidential, helpful tone. "Otherwise, you're going to anger him, and all he'll remember about you will be your insults. But don't tell him that his masks are beautiful. Just buy one." When I told Lucas Coronado that I wanted to trade my leather jacket for one of his masks, he grinned with satisfaction. He took the jacket and put it on. He walked to his house, but before he entered, he did some strange gyrations. He knelt in front of some sort of religious altar and moved his arms, as if to stretch them, and rubbed his hands on the sides of the jacket. He went inside the house and brought out a bundle wrapped in newspapers, which he handed to me. I wanted to ask him some questions. He excused himself, saying that he had to work, but added that if I wanted I could come back at another time. On the way back to the city of Guaymas, Jorge Campos asked me to open the bundle. He wanted to make sure that Lucas Coronado had not cheated me. I didn't care to open the bundle. My only concern was the possibility that I could come back by myself to talk to Lucas Coronado. I was elated. "I must see what you have," Jorge Campos insisted. "Stop the car, please." Not under any conditions or for any reasons whatsoever would I endanger my clients. You paid me to render some services to you. That man is a genuine shaman, therefore very dangerous. Because you have offended him, he may have given you a witchcraft bundle. If that's the case, we have to bury it quickly in this area. I felt a wave of nausea and stopped the car. With extreme care, I took out the bundle. Jorge Campos snatched it out of my hands and opened it. It contained 3 beautifully made traditional Yaqui masks. Jorge Campos mentioned, in a casual, disinterested tone, that it would be only proper that I give him one of them. I reasoned that since he had not yet taken me to see the old man, I had to preserve my connection with him. I gladly gave him one of the masks. "If you allow me to choose, I would rather take that one," he said, pointing. I told him to go ahead. The masks didn't mean anything to me. I had gotten what I was after. I would have given him the other two masks as well, but I wanted to show them to my anthropologist friends. "These masks are nothing extraordinary," Jorge Campos declared. "You can buy them in any store in town. They sell them to tourists there." I had seen the Yaqui masks that were sold in the stores in town. They were very rude masks in comparison to the ones I had, and Jorge Campos had indeed picked out the best. I left him in the city and headed for Los Angeles. Before I said goodbye, he reminded me that I practically owed him $2,000 because he was going to start as bribing and working toward taking me to meet the big man. "Do you think that you could give me my $2,000 the next time you come?" he asked daringly. His question put me in a terrible position. I believed that to tell him the truth, that I doubted it, would have made him drop me. I was convinced then that in spite of his patent greed, he was my usher. "I will do my best to have the money," I said in a noncommittal tone. "You gotta do better than that, boy," he retorted forcefully, almost angrily. "I'm going to spend money on my own, setting up this meeting, and I must have some reassurance on your part. I know that you are a very serious young man. How much is your car worth? Do you have the pink slip?" I told him what my car was worth, and that I did have the pink slip, but he seemed satisfied only when I gave him my word that I would bring him the money in cash on my next visit. 5 months later, I went back to Guaymas to see Jorge Campos. $2,000 at that time was a considerable amount of money, especially for a student. I thought that if perhaps he were willing to take partial payments, I would be more than happy to commit myself to pay that amount in installments. I couldn't find Jorge Campos anywhere in Guaymas. I asked the owner of the restaurant. He was as baffled as I was about his disappearance. "He has just vanished," he said. "I'm sure he went back to Arizona or to Texas, where he has business." I took a chance and went to see Lucas Coronado by myself. I arrived at his house at midday. I couldn't find him either. I asked his neighbors if they knew where he might be. They looked at me belligerently and didn't dignify me with an answer. I left, but went by his house again in the late afternoon. I didn't expect anything at all. In fact, I was prepared to leave for Los Angeles immediately. To my surprise, Lucas Coronado was not only there but was extremely friendly to me. He frankly expressed his approval on seeing that I had come without Jorge Campos, who he said was an outright pain in the ass. He complained that Jorge Campos, to whom he referred as a renegade Yaqui Indian, took delight in exploiting his fellow Yaquis. I gave Lucas Coronado some gifts that I had brought him and bought from him 3 masks, an exquisitely carved staff, and a pair of rattling leggings, made out of the cocoons of some insects from the desert, leggings which the Yaquis used in their traditional dances. Then I took him to Guaymas for dinner. I saw him every day for the 5 days that I remained in the area, and he gave me endless amounts of information about the Yaquis, their history and social organization, and the meaning and nature of their festivities. I was having such fun as a field worker that I even felt reluctant to ask him if he knew anything about the old shaman. Overcoming second thoughts, I finally asked Lucas Coronado if he knew the old man whom Jorge Campos had assured me was such a prominent shaman. Lucas Coronado seemed perplexed. He assured me that to his knowledge, no such man had ever existed in that part of the country, and that Jorge Campos was a crook who only wanted to cheat me out of my money. Hearing Lucas Coronado deny the existence of that old man had a terrible, unexpected impact on me. In one instant, it became evident to me that I really didn't give a damn about field work. I only cared about finding that old man. I knew then that meeting the old shaman had indeed been the culmination of something that had nothing to do with my desires, aspirations, or even thoughts as an anthropologist. I wondered more than ever who in the hell that old man was. Without any inhibitory checks, I began to rant and yell in frustration. I stomped on the floor. Lucas Coronado was quite taken aback by my display. He looked at me, bewildered, and then started to laugh. I had no idea that he could laugh. I apologized to him for my outburst of anger and frustration. I couldn't explain why I was so out of sorts. Lucas Coronado seemed to understand my quandary. "Things like that happen in this area," he said. I had no idea to what he was referring, nor did I want to ask him. I was deadly afraid of the easiness with which he took offense. A peculiarity of the Yaquis was the facility they had to feel offended. They seemed to be perennially on their toes, looking out for insults that were too subtle to be noticed by anyone else. "There are magical beings living in the mountains around here," he continued, "and they can act on people. They make people go veritably mad. People rant and rave under their influence, and when they finally calm down, exhausted, they don't have any clue as to why they exploded. Do you think that's what happened to me?" I asked. "Definitely," he replied with total conviction. "You already have a predisposition to going bonkers at the drop of a hat, but you are also very contained. Today, you weren't contained. You went bananas over nothing." "It isn't over nothing," I assured him. "I didn't know it until now, but to me that old man is the driving force of all my efforts." Lucas Coronado kept quiet, as if in deep thought. Then he began to pace up and down. "Do you know any old man who lives around here but is not quite from this area?" I asked him. He didn't understand my question. I had to explain to him that the old Indian I had met was perhaps like Jorge Campos, a Yaqui who had lived somewhere else. Lucas Coronado explained that the surname Matus was quite common in that area, but that he didn't know any Matus whose first name was Juan. He seemed despondent. Then he had a moment of insight and stated that because the man was old, he might have another name, and that perhaps he had given me a working name, not his real one. "The only old man I know," he went on, "is Ignacio Flores's father. He comes to see his son from time to time, but he comes from Mexico City. Come to think of it, he's Ignacio's father, but he doesn't seem that old. But he's old. Ignacio's old, too. His father seems younger, though." He laughed heartily at his realization. Apparently, he had never thought about the youth of the old man until that moment. He kept on shaking his head, as if in disbelief. I, on the other hand, was elated beyond measure. "That's the man!" I yelled without knowing why. Lucas Coronado didn't know where Ignacio Flores actually lived, but he was very accommodating and directed me to drive to a nearby Yaqui town, where he found the man for me. Ignacio Flores was a big corpulent man, perhaps in his mid-60s. Lucas Coronado had warned me that the big man had been a career soldier in his youth and that he still had the bearing of a military man. Ignacio Flores had an enormous mustache that and the fierceness of his eyes made him for me the personification of a ferocious soldier. He had a dark complexion. His hair was still jet black in spite of his years. His forceful, gravelly voice seemed to be trained solely to give commands. I had the impression that he had been a cavalryman. He walked as if he were still wearing spurs, and for some strange reason, impossible to fathom, I heard the sound of spurs when he walked. Lucas Coronado introduced me to him and said that I had come from Arizona to see his father, whom I had met in Nogales. Ignacio Flores didn't seem surprised at all. "Oh yes," he said. "My father travels a great deal." Without any other preliminaries, he directed us to where we could find his father. He didn't come with us, I thought, out of politeness. He excused himself and marched away, as if he were keeping step in a parade. I prepared myself to go to the old man's house with Lucas Coronado. Instead, he politely declined. He wanted me to drive him back to his house. "I think you found the man you were looking for, and I feel that you should be alone," he said. I marveled at how extraordinarily polite these Yaqui Indians were, and yet, at the same time, so fierce. I had been told that the Yaquis were savages who had no qualms about killing anyone. As far as I was concerned, though, their most remarkable feature was their politeness and consideration. I drove to the house of Ignacio Flores's father, and there I found the man I was looking for. "I wonder why Jorge Campos lied and told me that he knew you," I said at the end of my account. "He didn't lie to you," Don Juan said with the conviction of someone who was condoning Jorge Campos's behavior. "He didn't even misrepresent himself. He thought you were an easy mark and was going to cheat you. He couldn't carry out his plan, though, because Infinity overpowered him. Do you know that he disappeared soon after he met you, never to be found? Jorge Campos was a most meaningful personage for you," he continued. "You will find, in whatever transpired between the two of you, a sort of guiding blueprint, because he is the representation of your life." "Why? I'm not a crook," I protested. He laughed, as if he knew something that I didn't. The next thing I knew, I found myself in the midst of an extensive explanation of my actions, my ideals, my expectations. However, a strange thought urged me to consider with the same fervor with which I was explaining myself that under certain circumstances, I might be like Jorge Campos. I found the thought inadmissible, and I used all my available energy to try to disprove it. However, down in the depths of myself, I didn't care to apologize if I were like Jorge Campos. When I voiced my dilemma, Don Juan laughed so hard that he choked many times. "If I were you," he commented, "I'd listen to my inner voice. What difference would it make if you were like Jorge Campos? A crook. He was a cheap crook. You are more elaborate. This is the power of the recounting. This is why sorcerers use it. It puts you into contact with something that you didn't even suspect existed in you." I wanted to leave right then. Don Juan knew exactly how I felt. "Don't listen to the superficial voice that makes you angry," he said commandingly. "Listen to that deeper voice that is going to guide you from now on, the voice that is laughing. Listen to it. And laugh with it. Laugh. Laugh." His words were like a hypnotic command to me. Against my will, I began to laugh. Never had I been so happy. I felt free, unmasked. Recount to yourself the story of Jorge Campos over and over, Don Juan said. You will find endless wealth in it. Every detail is part of a map. It is the nature of infinity, once we cross a certain threshold, to put a blueprint in front of us. He peered at me for a long time. He didn't merely glance as before, but he gazed intently at me. One deed which Jorge Campos couldn't avoid performing, he finally said, was to put you in contact with the other man. Lucas Coronado, who is as meaningful to you as Jorge Campos himself, maybe even more. In the course of recounting the story of those two men, I had realized that I had spent more time with Lucas Coronado than with Jorge Campos. However, our exchanges had not been as intense and were marked by enormous lagoons of silence. Lucas Coronado was not by nature a talkative man, and by some strange twist, whenever he was silent, he managed to drag me with him into that state. Lucas Coronado is the other part of your map, Don Juan said. Don't you find it strange that he is a sculptor, like yourself, a super-sensitive artist who was, like yourself at one time, in search of a sponsor for his art? He looked for a sponsor just like you looked for a woman, a lover of the arts, who would sponsor your creativity. I entered into another terrifying struggle. This time my struggle was between my absolute certainty that I had not mentioned this aspect of my life to him, the fact that all of it was true, and the fact that I was unable to find an explanation for how he could have obtained this information. Again, I wanted to leave right away. But once more, the impulse was overpowered by a voice that came from a deep place. Without any coaxing, I began to laugh heartily. Some part of me, at a profound level, didn't give a hoot about finding out how Don Juan had gotten that information. The fact that he had it, and had displayed it in such a delicate but conniving manner, was a delightful maneuver to witness. It was of no consequence that the superficial part of me got angry and wanted to leave. Very good, Don Juan said to me, patting me forcefully on the back, very good. He was pensive for a moment, as if he were perhaps seeing things invisible to the average eye. Jorge Campos and Lucas Coronado are the two ends of an axis, he said. That axis is you, at one end a ruthless, shameless, crass mercenary who takes care of himself, hideous, but indestructible. At the other end a super-sensitive, tormented artist, weak and vulnerable. That should have been the map of your life, were it not for the appearance of another possibility, the one that opened up when you crossed a threshold of infinity. You searched for me, and you found me, and so, you did cross the threshold. The intent of infinity told me to look for someone like you. I found you, thus crossing the threshold myself. The conversation ended at that point. Don Juan went into one of his habitual long periods of total silence. It was only at the end of the day, when we had returned to his house and while we were sitting under his ramada, cooling off from the long hike we had taken, that he broke his silence. In your recounting of what happened between you and Jorge Campos, and you and Lucas Coronado, Don Juan went on, I found, and I hope you did too, a very disturbing factor. For me, it's an omen. It points to the end of an era, meaning that whatever was standing there cannot remain. Very flimsy elements brought you to me. None of them could stand on their own. This is what I drew from your recounting. I remembered that Don Juan had revealed to me one day that Lucas Coronado was terminally ill. He had some health condition that was slowly consuming him. I have sent word to him through my son Ignacio about what he should do to cure himself, Don Juan went on, but he thinks it's nonsense and doesn't want to hear it. It isn't Lucas's fault. The entire human race doesn't want to hear anything. They hear only what they want to hear. I remembered that I had prevailed upon Don Juan to tell me what I could say to Lucas Coronado to help him alleviate his physical pain and mental anguish. Don Juan not only told me what to tell him, but asserted that if Lucas Coronado wanted to, he could easily cure himself. Nevertheless, when I delivered Don Juan's message, Lucas Coronado looked at me as if I had lost my mind. Then he shifted into a brilliant, and, had I been a Yaqui, deeply insulting portrayal of a man who is bored to death by someone's unwarranted insistence. I thought that only a Yaqui Indian could be so subtle. Those things don't help me, he finally said defiantly, angered by my lack of sensibility. It doesn't really matter. We all have to die. But don't you dare believe that I have lost hope. I'm going to get some money from the government bank. I'll get an advance on my crops, and then I'll get enough money to buy something that will cure me, ipso facto. Its name is vitaminol. What is vitaminol? I had asked. It's something that's advertised on the radio, he said with the innocence of a child. It cures everything. It's recommended for people who don't eat meat or fish or fowl every day. It's recommended for people like myself who can barely keep body and soul together. In my eagerness to help Lucas Coronado, I committed right then the biggest blunder imaginable in a society of such hypersensitive beings as the Yaquis. I offered to give him the money to buy vitaminol. His cold stare was the measure of how deeply I had hurt him. My stupidity was unforgivable. Very softly, Lucas Coronado said that he was capable of affording vitaminol himself. I went back to Don Juan's house. I felt like weeping. My eagerness had betrayed me. Don't waste your energy worrying about things like that, Don Juan said coldly. Lucas Coronado is locked in a vicious cycle, but so are you. So is everyone. He has vitaminol, which he trusts will cure everything and resolve every one of his problems. At the Tiornit, he can't afford it, but he has great hopes that he eventually will be able to. Don Juan peered at me with his piercing eyes. I told you that Lucas Coronado's acts are the map of your life, he said. Believe you me, they are. Lucas Coronado pointed out vitaminol to you, and he did it so powerfully and painfully that he hurt you and made you weep. Don Juan stopped talking then. It was a long and most effective pause. And don't tell me that you don't understand what I mean, he said. One way or another, we all have our own version of vitaminol. And that's not all. Our experts and regular viewers respond to all comments. Also check if you forgot to subscribe and set your bell to receive notifications about new audiobooks and other useful self-development materials that we release regularly. Join in the discussions, don't forget to give likes and, if possible and inspired, support the development of the channel financially. All useful links will be in the description and the first attached comment. Goodness, love and wisdom to all. And now move on to watch the next part of the video at the links below, or choose something from the playlists of the channel and those you see on the screen.